Hey guys, all right, part two of our video tonight. Again, a double dose of Mr. T tonight. Trying to get caught back up from being behind this week, but kind of a part two here in regards to the Cold War in the 1950s and 60s. So where we left off just a few moments ago, we talked about the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Both of those during President John F. Kennedy's administration as President of the United States. But now there's a second part to Kennedy's administration and presidency as well. Okay, Kennedy has a lot of accomplishments here. Okay, a lot of accomplishments during the Cold War. A lot of great things to brag about Kennedy in his handling of the Cold War, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then also in regards to another issue taking place here in the United States, which was the Civil Rights Movement. And that's what we're going to be focusing on for the next several minutes, is going to be the Civil Rights Movement here in the United States. Now, I realize that this is world history and not just U.S. history, but this ties into a lot of civil rights movements across the world. What you have in the United States in the 50s and 60s and even 70s is pretty similar to what you have in other parts of the world at some point in time. And in all reality, also has a lot of political implications in world history as well, because in the very last part of this video, we'll talk about what happens that ends Kennedy's run as president, because the man only serves for a little over 2.5 years. And we'll talk about why that is. Part of that could be to do with civil rights. So strap in. That's what our video is going to be about here this time around. We're going to pick up with the Civil Rights Movement. So if you are following along with your notes, it's on the same PowerPoint that we just finished up with the Red Scare. All right. So we're taking a break from the Cold War for just a moment and talking about what happens in the Civil Rights Movement. Excuse me. All right. So to kind of set up what's happening here with civil rights, you have to go back to the end of the Civil War. The Civil War, which ended in 1865, is what ended slavery in the United States. Okay, the 13th Amendment in January of 1865 ended slavery in the United States forever. But with the end of that, is not that you automatically have blacks and whites that are automatically coexisting now. Okay, you do have that in some cases, but instead what happens over the next couple of decades after the Civil War is that you have what's called segregation. You have Jim Crow laws and black codes. And what you have are legal loopholes to try to keep black men from voting. You have a lot of segregation. Segregation is basically saying that whites have their own venues and blacks have their own venues. And that was made. That was said in concrete with the Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson, which pretty much legalized segregation. For example, you go to certain movie theaters and you have a white section, and you have a black section. You have certain towns where you have a white section of town and you have the black section of town. The phrase "the wrong side of the railroad tracks," that's kind of what that means. It goes back to the days of segregation. That's where that phrase was coined. If you notice, they've been taken down now, and it's kind of unfortunate because it's a very big learning point. But this time that we're off here, if you're over around downtown Athens, go over by Creme de Light. And again, they're not there anymore, but there used to be two different water fountains there on the side of Creme de Light. Okay, you have the front entrance there, where the windows are, and just to the left of that, you have some bathrooms. And there used to be two different water fountains. That water fountain, if you go back to the 1950s, one of those water fountains was for white people, and the other was for black people. Okay, that's during the time period of segregation, and that's what I'm getting to here. In that segregation separated blacks and whites in society. They're not allowed to eat in the same restaurants, to be in the same movie theaters, to be in the same places. Segregation was dominant. Now, obviously, you had places to where segregation didn't exist, but you did in a lot of places, including, unfortunately, here in Alabama and in the South, a lot of segregation. So as we get to the civil rights movement is really going to begin in 1954 because we get a Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Education. And what happens out of this Supreme Court decision is that basically it comes down to segregation of schools, and where kids had to go to school. Okay, black kids cannot go to white schools, even if they wanted to, or even if they lived in that district. And that's what Brown v. Board of Education came down to. What it was that it came. It was a Supreme Court case in Topeka, Kansas. It was against the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, so that Brown could send his kid to the school that he wanted to, regardless of segregation. And so what the Supreme Court said was that segregation is unconstitutional. And so in 1954, Brown v. Board of Education is going to desegregate schools all across the country because it is now against federal law to segregate any schools whatsoever. Which means that you now have blacks and whites going to the same school for the first time ever. Now, this is going to take several years to actually implement, and there are a lot of things that happen along the way. And I'm going to skip on now to the end of the slide here. In 1957, you have one of the biggest cases. Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, is desegregated, and with that, you get a lot of protests, you get a lot of riots, you get a lot of things that, keep in mind. And I'm not defending anything whatsoever. Okay, the attitude here was wrong. Okay, to say that blacks are inferior to whites, to try to keep people from the whole aspect of the mindset here was just flat out wrong, and thinking that blacks and whites were not equal. Okay. And again, not to defend anybody whatsoever, but that had been the mindset for so long to where that's just what people thought and believed. It's like rooting for Alabama versus Auburn. Okay. Why do you root for Alabama or Auburn? Well, my parents did. My grandparents did. Okay. It's kind of something that you inherit as time goes along. And so, unfortunately, this idea that blacks and whites are not equal, that was just something that was just taught for so long where people actually believed it. And so, to all of a sudden to say that, hey, what you've always done, you can't do that anymore. Okay, that people don't like change, and this was a big change. Now, again, not to defend those people that were against desegregation, but just kind of give you an idea of the mindset. Again, point of view here is important in understanding history. So, Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, a big event. In 1962, you have another big event taking place at Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi, to where you have the first black student that's going to enroll there. His name is James Meredith. This is not just public high schools here. You're also talking about universities that forever had not allowed black students. And so what happens in 1962 is that James Meredith, again, by order of the Supreme Court, is going to be allowed to enroll into Ole Miss, into the University of Mississippi. And what happens is that there are a lot of riots. Even the governor of Mississippi, and I can't think of his name right now, but the governor of Mississippi is going to do everything that he can to keep James Meredith from enrolling. What you have is a lot of violence, a lot of terrorization, and the whole thing is fiasco. The Kennedy administration does get involved here, specifically Bobby Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, who is the Attorney General. But the United States government did not play a direct role in this. Okay, they were pretty much on the phones with the governor of Mississippi saying, hey, you better make sure that things are going well down there. There was a lot of trust here with the federal government that it's your state, you handle the situation, and we'll stay out of it. But what happens here in 1962 at Ole Miss is something that John and Bobby Kennedy are going to remember, to where when this situation comes up again, no more trusting the states to do what's right. They're going to do what's right. So in regards to desegregation of schools, a lot of things happening here. Okay, let's go back a little bit in regards to the timeline. December 1st, 1955, a woman named Rosa Parks, who was a black woman in Montgomery, the capital of Alabama, who was on the public bus. Now, buses, just like everything else, is segregated, which means that there was a section that whites could sit in, and there was a section that blacks could sit in. black people sat at the back of the bus. Well, Rosa Parks, who is a black woman, had gotten on the bus going home from work. She was sitting in a seat. A couple stops later, a white man gets on, and he wants to sit in the seat that Rosa Parks is sitting in. Okay, she's kind of sitting borderline in the section there of where she's supposed to be, and he orders her to get up, and she refuses. Rosa Parks stands her ground. No, I was here first. I'm tired. This is where I'm sitting. I'm not going to move just because you're white and I'm black. No, she's arrested. Okay, it was a law. She was arrested, and this kind of sparks the whole civil rights movement in Alabama. Okay, I love this state of Alabama. I was born and raised here. There are a lot of great things about this state, especially North Alabama. We have so many job opportunities, engineering, and rocket science. So many great things that are taking place in North Alabama today. But there's a time period where Alabama was a joke when it came to treatment of blacks and whites and equality. Black people in Alabama were treated wrong for a long, 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 long time. And unfortunately, Alabama is going to be at the forefront of the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks in Montgomery, Alabama. And as we go further, there's a lot of Alabama being put into the forefront here. You have Montgomery, you have Selma, you have Tuscaloosa, you have Birmingham, all major things happening in those cities. So when it comes down to the civil rights movement, Alabama is right there at the forefront. And I say that unfortunately. Again, I'm proud to be a Southerner, proud to be from Alabama, but there's a part of our history to where I wish it was completely different, to where we did the wrong thing. Because of what happened to Rosa Parks, you have a man named Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist preacher originally from Atlanta, who comes to the aid of Rosa Parks, as well as becomes at the forefront movement of the civil rights movement in Alabama. In 1956, keep in mind that Rosa Parks is arrested on December 1st, 1955. In 1956, you have the Montgomery bus boycott, to where black men and women are going to refuse to ride the buses there at Montgomery in protest. Now you say, big deal. Well, it is a big deal because you're talking about a lot of money. Okay, there's a lot of money in that was being lost here with this boycott, and so it's supposed to be a protest for the bus system in Montgomery to relax on their rules, specifically in regards to Rosa Parks. So you had the Montgomery bus boycott, which gets very, very tense here in Montgomery. Also in 1956, you have the first black student admitted into the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, and her name is Autherine Lucy. Autherine Lucy was a woman, a black woman, and the first black student ever enrolled at the University of Alabama. She will not graduate, at least not at this point in time, unfortunately. Okay. Again, a lot of people in Alabama had a backwards way of thinking at this point in time, and they pretty much forced Lucy off of campus. And so Autherine Lucy will drop out. She does become officially the first black person ever in Tuscaloosa at the university, but she drops out before graduating. But don't worry, she comes back later on. She'll have her day. She will later on go back to Tuscaloosa to the University of Alabama. She will graduate, and actually today is a very, very important alumni. I say today, I think she might have actually passed away a couple of years ago. But when it's all said and done, very, very important alumni there. During the civil rights movement, you have obviously Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who is the biggest civil rights leader that there is. Martin Luther King Jr., a great man by all means, very courageous and brave because he endured not only a lot of political pressure, but a lot of things in regards to safety. Okay, there was a lot of threats against his life. A very brave man. But Martin Luther King Jr. was not the only civil rights leader. There are a lot of guys out there that led the way. On the other side of Martin Luther King Jr. was a man named Malcolm X. Now, Malcolm X was also a black man, a leader of the civil rights movement, but had a very different outlook as to how the civil rights movement should have taken place. The difference between Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X comes in their styles. King was a man who, by all means, was going to stand up for what was right and was not going to back down. But King had the philosophy that we're going to try to do everything peacefully. Okay, we're not going to use violence. We're not going to go beat white men and white women. We're not going to get violent. We're going to peacefully protest. That's what the Constitution grants us. The First Amendment says that we have the right to peacefully protest. So that's what we're going to do. Maybe against the law, because some of the laws during this time were just flat out messed up and backwards, but we're certainly going to do this peacefully and diplomatically. Malcolm X had a different viewpoint. Malcolm X was one of these guys to where he said, it needs to happen. It needs to happen now. And I don't care what we have to do to make it happen. So Malcolm X was a guy who is a lot more radical. And when I say radical, I mean violent. Malcolm X was not afraid to use violence in his movement. And it was very effective. Okay. There were a lot of people who were just flat out sick and tired of what was going on, and for good reason. I mean, my goodness, if I was part of this crowd during this time period and I've been treated this way for so long, then yeah, I'm going to get sick and tired of putting up with it, and I'm going to fight back. And so, rightfully so, in a lot of cases, Malcolm X, in finally getting sick and tired, and he basically had the thought that, hey, diplomacy is not going to work here. We're going to have to fight for our independence. We're going to have to fight for our freedoms, just like the founding fathers did against the British. But now what you have here is that you have two different movements of the civil rights movement. You have the peaceful movement under Martin Luther King Jr., and you have the more violent movement under Malcolm X. Matter of fact, King pretty much denounced Malcolm X because of his violence. He said that's not how it should be done. But now, interesting twist here, and this is important to understand in regards to the importance of both men. Malcolm X does get to a point to where he realizes that what he does in regards to his violence and being so radical is really going to end up giving more support to Martin Luther King Jr. Because let's say that you're the president of the United States and you have this big old phenomenon taking place in the South. Okay, a lot of things going on in regards to civil rights. People getting arrested left and right, people getting beaten, all this violence. And you have this one movement over here who is, yeah, they're getting into a lot of trouble, but they're really doing things peacefully. They're not trying to fight. On the other side, you got Malcolm X and his group who are just trying to beat anybody possible. Well, it makes Martin Luther King Jr. look really good, okay? It makes him look like he's trying to at least cooperate. It makes him look like he's trying to be the better man here. Yeah, he's standing up for what's right, but he's trying to do it the right way. And so what it does is that it actually gives more momentum and more support for Martin Luther King Jr. to where King is actually going to get the support of a lot of politicians, including President Kennedy, as Kennedy becomes president of the United States. And Malcolm X realizes this. I've got a book in my classroom. I didn't have a chance to grab it before this whole break, but it's a very good book. It's based off of primary documents, based off of letters by both King and Malcolm X. And when I read through this book about 10 years ago, what I realized and what I read in Malcolm X's letters is that Malcolm X realized that what he did was actually give momentum for King. Okay, his violence actually helped King have more diplomacy success. And so what happens is that Malcolm X is pretty much going to be a martyr, which means that he knows that he's not going to be the popular one. He knows that his movement is not going to win, but he knows that what he's doing is going to help out King in his movement. And at the end of the day, they both want the same thing, and that is equality. And so Malcolm X does come to that realization that what he's doing is actually helping out King in his movement. And hey, we're fighting for the same goal here. And so I'll keep doing it. Unfortunately, Malcolm X will be assassinated. And I'm trying to think of the exact date here. Malcolm X will be killed 1965, February of 1965. And so it's a little further into the future of what we're talking about now. Ironically, Malcolm X is killed. Malcolm X was Muslim, and he was killed by a fellow Muslim. And so you would think, and it was certainly a casualty of the civil rights movement. But it wasn't some good old boy from Alabama that assassinated him. Let's say that. Okay, it was a set of different situation. But Martin Luther King here is going to end up becoming the leader of the civil rights movement as we go further along. So as we do go further along, then a lot of things taking place here. As we get into the 1960s, and as John F. Kennedy comes into office. Again, Alabama is at the forefront here. Now, in Birmingham, you have a man named Bull Connor. Bull Connor is going to be the mayor of Birmingham in the early 60s. And Bull Connor is one of these good old boy white boys that is all for segregation and is completely against civil rights, is completely against equality. He believes that white man is here and black man is here, and that's just the way it needs to be. And so as a result, Bull Connor is going to be not only stubborn, but is going to pretty much be a terrorist. He's going to give the order to his police officers in Birmingham that any of these protesters, I want you to beat them. I want you to use physical activity. I want you to beat them. I want you to punch them. I want you to kick them. I want you to turn on the water hoses to get them out of the streets. And again, what we have here is that this was Martin Luther King Jr.'s movement here, a peaceful movement, a peaceful protest of, and Bull Connor says, I don't care what you got to do, shut them down. And in some cases, that literally meant turning on the fire hoses. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever been around an actual fire hose, but you're talking about a water hose that's used to put out a house fire. You want to talk about a lot of power. That sucker will knock you on your tail. And that's exactly what happens here, is that police officers in Birmingham are going to beat protesters with billy clubs. They're going to kick them. They're going to spit on them. They're going to punch them. And they're going to take fire hoses and blast those protesters. And again, that's going to knock you right over. Okay, you're not going to walk away from that. So Bull Connor pretty much ignites terror in Birmingham. Now, also in 1963, you have the governor of Alabama that is just about as bad, and his name is George Wallace. Okay, I showed this video or at least this cover in the intro. Okay, George Wallace was the governor of Alabama in 1963. George Wallace was a very interesting guy. That when he is elected governor in 1962, he runs off of the slogan "Segregation today, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever." Okay, George Wallace was one of the biggest proponents against desegregation, and he is the Alabama governor version of Bull Connor. Okay, to where Wallace does not stand for desegregation. Wallace does not stand for equal rights. And Wallace, upon his inauguration speech, says, "I'll do whatever I have to keep Alabama from desegregating. If that means that I have to stand in the schoolhouse door in the University of Alabama to prevent black students from enrolling, then I will do so." Well, fast forward to June 11th, 1963, just a few months after George Wallace said that. Okay, now we talked a few minutes ago about how Arthur and Lucy in 1956, actually becomes the first black person to enroll in the University of Alabama. Okay, but she doesn't stay. Okay, she's pretty much run out of town. Well, on June 11th, 1963, you have the first black students after Arthur and Lucy who is set to enroll. Vivian Malone and not James Meredith. I had to look up his name. Vivian Malone. James Hood. James Hood was the man. James Hood and Vivian Malone were going to be the first two black students after Arthur and Lucy to enroll into the University of Alabama. So over the last 7 years, no black student had ever been on campus. So on June 11th, both Hood and Malone were set to register for classes. Again, George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, said, "Hey, I will do whatever I need to. If I have to physically block them from registering, that's what I'm going to do." So here comes June 11th, the morning to register. Vivian Malone and James Hood are on campus, and they get to Foster Hall to where they're going to register for classes. And guess who is there? George Wallace. George Wallace, who is protected by the Alabama State Troopers Association, is literally standing in the schoolhouse door there in the University of Alabama to prevent these two students from enrolling for classes. Now, this time around, Kennedy is not going to take any chances. Okay, when the University of Mississippi desegregated, back in 62, just a year earlier, basically Kennedy's left it up to the governor of Mississippi. It's your state, you handle it. Well, Kennedy's not taking that chance this time around. Okay, he's going to make sure that this thing goes smoothly. So John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy are going to have a lot of hands in making sure that these two people are going to enroll safely into the University of Alabama. And so they send Nicholas Katzenbach, who is the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, a member of the federal government, to pretty much order Wallace to stand down. So the schoolhouse doors stand by George Wallace. Wallace will eventually move out of the way, and Malone and Hood will register for classes, and they will stay at the University of Alabama. But this is George Wallace. For him, for George Wallace, it's all about politics. I'm going to speak on this for just a minute here, because I've done a lot of research on George Wallace. My senior paper in college was about George Wallace and civil rights here in Alabama. And here's the thing about Wallace, in that everything that Wallace did here was for show. Okay, Wallace actually ran for office in 1958, and I can't remember if it was Attorney General. It was some kind of public office in Alabama, and he lost. And the reason that he lost was that George Wallace, when it came to civil rights, he was more of a moderate. Really, George Wallace could care less. Segregation, desegregation, he didn't care one way or the other. And the man that he was running against was a die-hard segregationist. And George Wallace made the claim at that point in time, I will never lose an election again based off of segregation. And so George Wallace completely changes his viewpoints. At that point in time, he'll be hardcore segregationist. And so everything that he does here, this is all for show. This is all to get votes. This is all to get support. Wallace said, hey, I will stand in the schoolhouse door to prevent these students from registering. Well, George Wallace here, even though that didn't happen, yeah, he stood in the schoolhouse door. The two students registered anyway. But hey, George Wallace went toe-to-toe with the federal government. He went toe-to-toe with the president of the United States. So yeah, for him, this is a political success. It's all about politics. Excuse me. So in Alabama, you got a lot of stuff that happens. Also in 1963, you have the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in downtown Birmingham, where you have several young black children that are killed and injured in a church bombing there, all part of the Civil Rights Movement. In 1965, you have the Civil Rights March from Selma to Montgomery across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which at first was not successful. The state troopers stop it on the first attempt. On the second attempt, it is successful. And so basically what it comes down to here is that you look at year after year after year, especially here in Alabama, you have George Wallace, you have Bull Connor, you have the old backwards mindset that segregation should live forever and that blacks and whites are not equal. And you're taking decades and centuries worth of that mindset and you're completely changing it around. And you're having to deal with the process of doing that. So for Martin Luther King Jr., for guys like Joe Louis, who is now a congressman from Georgia, for these civil rights leaders, what they had to go through to make this happen, these men are true heroes, true bravery. A lot of respect for these men and women who stood up for what was right, by the way. They were completely right in doing so. On August the 28th, 1963, you have the March on Washington for the Civil Rights Movement. That's where Martin Luther King gives the famous I Have a Dream speech, that one little day, my 4 little girls can play with white boys and girls and will not be judged based off of the color of their skin, but based off the content of their character. I'm going to post this speech onto the classroom page. Please watch it. It's a very, very, very good speech. And if we only went by the words of Martin Luther King today, if we only went off of what he said, of putting personal feelings and politics to the side, and if we treated each other like we wanted to be treated, and if color didn't matter, if we were based off the content of our characters and not off the color of our skin, Man, if we went by those words, imagine what kind of country we would be today. Imagine what kind of, we are more divided now than we have been in a long, long time. And it's sad. It is really a shame. And we're divided over stupid crap that we're divided over. Kneeling for the flag and all kinds of junk like that. Um, yeah, that's their right to do so. That's a great about this country is that we have the freedom to do those things and not be arrested for it. But at the same time, it's that kind of crap that's dividing our country. If only we went by Martin Luther King's words in this speech, imagine how far we could come in this nation if we actually live by the words of King. And that is blacks and whites and everybody is included in that. If everybody went by those words. So please watch that speech. Getting down to the end of this, in August of 1965, you had the Voting Rights Act, which is going to get rid of Jim Crow laws. Voting rights are going to be restored to a lot of black men and women. Things like the poll tax are going to be taken away. It's a step in the right direction to get true civil rights. The civil rights movement is not going to end here. It's going to go on for at least another decade or two. You have a lot of things that take place. It's going to be a long process. You're talking about completely changing an entire culture and society, and their thinking. It's going to take several decades. I would like to think that at least here in Alabama, we've gotten to a pretty good point in regards to equality. Obviously, I'm not in every territory of the state, and obviously, I'm not experiencing a lot of the things other people are experiencing. But I would like to think that we've come a long way in this. And I hope that we're at the forefront of where we should be as a nation. I hear a lot of things about our country, and at least in the area that we live in, I just don't see a lot of it. And I hope that I'm true in that. I hope that what I'm seeing is actually how it is, because nobody should be discriminated based off the color of their skin. That's just stupid. Okay, so the civil rights movement does not end in 1965. It's going to go on for several more decades. In some cases, it's still going today. But this is kind of the heyday of it. The 1950s, 1960s, going into the 1970s. Interesting story here. I'm not going to go into this, but if you want to look up Bear Bryant and the first black football player at the University of Alabama, very interesting story there. Bear Bryant actually has a lot to do with the desegregation of Alabama. Bear Bryant was the Nick Saban of the 1960s and 70s, and he could do things that most others couldn't. And so Bear Bryant had a pretty big hand in trying to desegregate the state of Alabama. Look it up. All right, so again, all this happens during, or at least all this happens during Kennedy's administration. Again, to give John F. Kennedy a lot of praise here, Kennedy did a lot in regards to civil rights. Okay, there are several different parts to Kennedy's presidency. You have the Cold War, which again, the more that I read about it, the more I like about it, about how he handled the Cuban Missile Crisis and several other things. When it came to civil rights, again, the more I read about Kennedy, the more I like him when it comes to civil rights, because he did a phenomenal job. Yes, he increased the size of government. He increased the pressure and power of the government, but he did it for the right reasons. Because some of these states had to be forced to do it. And I'm all for the 10th Amendment and letting states dictate their own way. But in this case, the federal government needed to step in against George Wallace, against Bull Connor, and all praises to John Kennedy for and Bobby Kennedy as well for making that happen. So a lot of things that Kennedy had to deal with that. Personally, he's one of my favorite presidents because of the great accomplishments that he had in such a short period of time. Now, let me say this. There are two parts to Kennedy. You have Kennedy the president, and you have Kennedy the man. Kennedy the president was awesome in my eyes. I thought that he was a great president. Kennedy as a man was a jerk. All right. He cheated on his wife several times. He was known to be a playboy, supposedly had an affair with Marilyn Monroe. Okay. And again, this is not for young years. But I do want to point that out. I'm giving a lot of praise to John F. Kennedy. There's a part to Kennedy to where he was just a downright jerk. Okay, as a regular human being, he was a jerk. He did his wife wrong. He did a lot of people wrong. But as president, John Kennedy was one of the greatest, in my opinion. Great leader. And so as we begin to close this out, there's one more thing that I want to talk about with Kennedy, and that is what leads to his to the end of his presidency. John F. Kennedy will be president of the United States from 1961, January of 1961, to November of 1963, only 2.5 years. Now, if you do the math, that's not even one full term. So what happens to Kennedy? Why is he only president for a short time period? Keep in mind all the things we talked about tonight about Kennedy's accomplishments. The Bay of Pigs invasion, which is not an accomplishment, okay, that's a black mark against Kennedy, but the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Cuban Missile Crisis, diverting nuclear war against the Soviets, being strong, civil rights, all that happened within a 2.5-year period of Kennedy's presidency. So what leads to the end of Kennedy's presidency? Well, it happens on November 22nd, 1963. Kennedy is about to kick off his re-election tour, okay, the re-election of 1964. Okay, so you're less than a year away from JFK having to be reelected, and so he's getting to the point to where he's about to go to different states to about to start campaigning to get reelected. And on November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy is in Texas. Okay, he's going to go to Houston, and then he's going to go to Dallas. Texas, in particular, here was something that was special because Kennedy's vice president, who was Lyndon Johnson was from Texas. And so his visit to Texas here in 1963 was something to where he was personally invited by the vice president. This was supposed to kick off his 1964 presidential campaign. He was going to speak in Houston that morning, which he did, and then flew to Dallas, where he was going to speak there as well. And then he was going to go back to Lyndon Johnson's ranch for a while to visit with the vice president. Well, as President Kennedy lands in Dallas, he has his wife Jackie with him. Okay, they've had a lot of hard times. Again, John Kennedy cheated on his wife several times, and she knew it. And so they've gone through some pretty rocky times in their marriage. It's believed that at this point in time, they kind of got back on track a little bit. But there was a parade set up, okay? Kennedy exits Air Force One. He and his wife, Jackie, are going to get into the presidential limo and are going to ride through the streets of Dallas, okay? Now, in this time period, you didn't have a fully loaded limousine that had 6-inch bulletproof steel and glass, okay? Matter of fact, the limousine that Kennedy is riding in is a convertible. This is a different time period here, okay? And that he was riding in a convertible. So in this limousine, in the front seat, you had the governor of Texas, who was John Connally. The middle two, Connally was in the second seat. And then in the back row, the third row, was President Kennedy and his wife, Jackie. So they're going along this parade route, heading to where Kennedy is going to speak at this luncheon. And then they get on to what's called Dealey Plaza. Okay, they turn onto the road going through Dealey Plaza, which was a grassy area there in downtown Dallas. And as his limousine makes his way down Dealey Plaza, shots open up. Okay, Kennedy is shot through the neck, goes through his neck. That bullet also hits Governor Connally as well in the back. A second shot rains out, misses apparently. And then the third shot, just seconds later, hits Kennedy right in the back of the head. John F. Kennedy is fatally shot in the head. He will be taken to Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas, but it's no use. Kennedy is dead. President John F. Kennedy becomes only the second president in history to directly be assassinated. Now, we've had presidents die in office besides Kennedy and besides Lincoln. Lincoln was the first one to be assassinated. And we've had presidents who were killed, they were shot or they were injured and then died later on. But Kennedy becomes only the second to die immediately from an assassination attempt. He's taken to Parkland Memorial Hospital to where he dies. And Vice President Johnson takes over. Now, there's a lot of things that come out of Kennedy's assassination. The man that's responsible is a man named Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald was a former Marine. and was a Soviet sympathizer. Okay, go back to the Cold War here. Lee Harvey Oswald had actually wanted to become a Soviet citizen at one point in time. The Russians rejected him. And so Oswald had a lot of mental issues, had a lot of issues in regards to who he identified with, in regards to American versus Russian, communist versus capitalist. And when it came down to it, Lee Harvey Oswald is going to set up in what's called the Texas School Book Depository, I think the fifth floor of the building, and will kill the President of the United States. Vice President Lyndon Johnson takes over as president. And this is where things begin to get a little shaky. Okay, Lee Harvey Oswald is on the run. He'll be arrested in a movie theater there in Dallas. He's arrested. 2 days later, Oswald, after immense interrogation, is going to be moved to the jail there in Dallas. And as he's being moved from the police precinct down to the car, they are actually going down next to a row of reporters, which is very unusual because this was a high-profile case. And a man named Jack Ruby, who is a local nightclub owner, is going to shoot and kill Lee Harvey Oswald. So think about this. The President of the United States is shot and killed. The man who supposedly killed him 2 days later will also be shot and killed, which leads to all kinds of conspiracy theories as to, was Lee Harvey Oswald the only shooter? Was he even part of it? Was he a martyr? Was he set up? Who really killed who really killed President John Fitzgerald Kennedy? There is an investigation that's opened up called the Warren Commission. Congress will actually investigate to see if there's more to the story. They will use the Zapruder film. The Zapruder film is was at that point in time the only known live footage of the assassination itself. And so they go through immense investigations and interviews. And what they come up with was that Lee Harvey Oswald was indeed the only shooter. 3 shots total. The first one goes through Kennedy's neck, will wound him, and the third shot will fatally kill him. Now, at this point, what we normally do in class is that we usually have a debate as to who really killed John Fitzgerald Kennedy. 50 years, almost 60 years now, after the death of John Kennedy, is still the most widely debated topic in American history outside of maybe the Civil War. Who really killed Kennedy? Was it Lee Harvey Oswald? Was he acting alone? And all you have to do is ask your parents, your grandparents, aunts, and uncles, and the debates are going to start up. So what we would normally do at this point in time is a debate. What I plan on doing is at some point in time early next week, I'm going to offer you guys an opportunity to debate. Was Lee Harvey Oswald the actual killer of John Kennedy? Was there somebody else that was working with Oswald? Was Oswald set up? Okay, do some research on this. Look at some footage. Okay, there is actual live footage. You can look at the Zapruder film. Look at the videos, the documentaries, the conspiracy theories. Okay, and see what you come up with. Okay, I will send out a message in the classroom page, and I will set up a Zoom meeting for anybody who wants to take part in this debate. Okay, this will not be for a grade, but if you want to participate, this is the favorite thing I do all year long. This is my favorite thing that we do all year long in any of my classes, because of how this debate always goes. Everybody gets involved. It is very interesting to look at, and there are so many conspiracy theories, and what's true and what's not true is really hard to distinguish. So keep that in mind. Start doing your research. In the meantime, I will start posting some videos of the things that we've talked so far about the Red Scare. But this brings us from the Red Scare up to the assassination of President Kennedy. In my next video, we'll move on past this, and we'll get further into the Cold War in the mid-1960s going into the 1970s. All right, so I will see you guys next time.